Hello and welcome to our Flip video lesson 2.07, Learning Something New Every Day, Pompeii. And the video links recordings will be there once this video finishes. Learning objectives of this lesson: analyze ancient Pliny's writings and modern archaeological evidence, information on Pompeii, look for examples of daily life there, demonstrate mastery of knowledge and skills taught in the previous lessons about archaeology, examine historical documents and archaeological evidence about Pompeii to find out about daily life in the city, identify Pompeii and its archaeological significance, and recognize that historical knowledge changes with new discoveries. So introduction, obviously we're going to talk about archaeology. There was quite a bit of a theme going there in our objectives, and daily life in Pompeii. Student guide questions 326 to 328, or pages I should say. There's going to be some important vocabulary to help with your understanding of the lesson. And there are no reading pages for this lesson, but it is important to note that, as always, you do need to be completing your work in your OMS. But there are also pages in your OMS that go directly with this student guide. So you'll need to be able to have those read or read those in order to complete the student guide lesson for today. 2.07, Learning Something New Every Day in Pompeii. In August AD 79, the volcano Vesuvius erupted, completely burying the southern Italian city of Pompeii. Archaeologists began excavating the city in the 1700s, and by the mid-1800s they had unearthed public buildings, homes, shops, and villas, and begun to carefully document their findings. Archaeologists today are still discovering Pompeii. The ruins of Pompeii gave us great insight into what life was like in Roman times. So this is where I want to show you in your OMS. As always, you need to be completing your OMS lessons, but particularly today, there are some reading pages in there that are not in your Human Odyssey book, but they are in your OMS that need to be read before you can complete the student guide on page 327, describing Pliny's account and then archaeological information. So you can see that here. Okay? All right, so this is where the OMS begins. Explore a primary source. A primary source is an object or document that provides direct evidence of an event or time period. Primary sources include diaries, letters, census data, speeches, and eyewitness accounts. A primary source may also be visual evidence such as photographs, maps, and paintings. In today's lesson, you will examine primary and secondary sources to learn about daily life in Pompeii and the destruction of the city. Read two letters by Pliny the Younger that contain dramatic descriptions of the eruption of Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii. As you read, begin recording information about the eruption in your history journal or the online notebook. Write Pliny's description above your information, practice taking notes efficiently, use single words or short phrases, and abbreviate as you wish. And so you can go ahead and do that part if you would like, or you can just use the student guide on page 327 to fill in these answers. And so you can either skip this part of the flip video and read on your own in the OMS, or you can follow along as I read the OMS slides to you. So here's a picture of Mount Vesuvius. Obviously, when it erupted, it was definitely a sight to see. So Pliny letter 616. My dear Tacitus, you asked me to write you something about the death of my uncle, so that the account you transmit to posterity is as reliable as possible. I am grateful to you, for I see that his death will be remembered forever, if you treat it in your histories. He perished in a devastation of the loveliest of lands, in a memorable disaster shared by peoples and cities, but this will be a kind of eternal life for him. Although he wrote a number of enduring works himself, the imperishable nature of your writings will add a great deal to his survival. Happy are they, in my opinion, to whom it is given either to do something worth writing about or to write something worth reading. Most happy, of course, those who do both. With his own books and yours, my uncle will be counted among the latter. It is therefore with great pleasure that I take up, or rather take upon myself, the task you have sent me. And this is a primary source document. This is an actual letter. He was at Misenum in his capacity as commander of the fleet on the 24th of August, when between 2 and 3 in the afternoon my mother drew his attention to a cloud of unusual size and appearance. He had had a sun bath, then a cold bath, and was reclining after dinner with his books. He called for his shoes and climbed up to where he could get the best view of the phenomenon. The cloud was rising from a mountain, at such a distance we couldn't tell which, but afterwards learned that it was Vesuvius. I can best describe its shape by likening to a pine tree. It rose into the sky on a very long trunk from which spread some branches. I imagine it had been raised by a sudden blast, which then weakened, leaving the cold unsupported so that its weight caused it to spread sideways. Some of the cloud was white. In other parts there were dark patches of dirt and ash. The sight of it made the scientist in my uncle determined to see it from closer at hand. He ordered a boat made ready. He offered me the opportunity of going along, but I preferred to study. He himself happened to have set me a writing exercise. As he was leaving the house, he was brought a letter from Tasca's wife, Rectina, who was terrified by the looming danger. Her villa lay at the foot of Vesuvius, and there was no way out except by boat. She begged him to get her way. He changed his plans. The expedition that started out as a quest for knowledge now called for courage. He launched the quadremes and embarked himself, a source of aid for more people than just Rectina, for that delightful shore was a populous one. He hurried to a place from which others were fleeing, and held his course directly into danger. Was he afraid? It seems not, as he kept up a continuous observation of the various movements and shapes of that evil cloud, dictating what he saw. Ash was falling onto the ships now, darker and denser the closer they went. Now it was bits of pumice and rocks that were blackened and burned and shattered by the fire. Now the sea is shoal, debris from the mountain blocks the shore. He paused for a moment, wondering whether to turn back as the helmsman urged him. Fortune helps the brave, he said. Head for Pompanius. At Stabiae, on the other side of the bay, formed by gradually curving shore, Pompanius had loaded up his ships even before the danger arrived. Though it was visible and indeed extremely close, once it intensified. He planned to put out as soon as the contrary wind let up. That very wind carried my uncle right in, and he embraced the frightened man and gave him comfort and courage. In order to lessen the other's fear by showing his own unconcern, he asked to be taken to the baths. He bathed and dined, carefree, or at least appearing so, which is equally impressive. Meanwhile, broad sheets of flame were lighting up many parts of Vesuvius. Their light and brightness were the more vivid for the darkness of the night. To alleviate people's fears, my uncle claimed that the flames came from the deserted homes of farmers who had left in a panic, with the hearth fires still all alight. Then he rested and gave every indication of actually sleeping. People who passed by his door heard his snores, which were rather resonant since he was a heavy man. The ground outside his room rose so high with the mixture of ash and stones that if he had spent any more time there, the escape would have been impossible. He got up and came out, restoring himself to Pompanius and others who had been unable to sleep. They discussed what to do, whether to remain under cover or to try the open air. The buildings were being rocked by a series of strong tremors and appeared to have come loose from their foundations, and to be sliding this way and that. Outside, however, there was danger from the rocks that were coming down. Light and fire consumed as these bits of pumice were. Weighing the relative dangers, they chose the outdoors. In my uncle's case, it was a rational decision. Others just chose the alternative that frightened them the least. They tied pillows on top of their heads as protection against the shower of rock. It was daylight now elsewhere in the world, but the darkness was darker and thicker than any night. But they had torches and other lights. They decided to go down to the shore to see from close if anything was possible by sea. But it remained as rough and uncooperative as before. Resting in the shade of a sail, he drank once or twice from the cold water he had asked for. Then came a smell of sulfur, announcing the flames and the flames themselves, sending others into flight, but reviving him. Supported by two small slaves, he stood up and immediately collapsed. As I understand it, his breathing was obstructed by the dust-laden air, and his innards, which were never strong and often blocked or upset, simply shut down. When daylight came again 2 days after, he died. His body was found untouched, unharmed, in the clothing that he had on. He looked more asleep than dead. Meanwhile, at Misnium, my mother and I, but this had nothing to do with history, and you only asked for information about his death. I'll stop here then, but I will say one more thing, namely that I have written out everything that I did at the time and heard while memories were still fresh. You will use the important bits, for it is one thing to write a letter, another to write history. one thing to write to a friend, another to write for the public. Farewell. Penny's letter 620. My dear Tectus, you say the letter I wrote for you about my uncle's death made you want to know about my fearful ordeal at Misenum. This is where I broke off. The mind shudders to remember, but here is the tale. After my uncle's departure, I finished up my studies as I had planned. Then I had a bath, then dinner, and a short, unsatisfactory night. There had been tremors for many days, previously a common occurrence in Campania, and no cause for panic. But that night the shaking grew much stronger. People thought it was an upheaval, not just a tremor. My mother burst into my room as I got up. I said she should rest and I would rouse her. We sat out on a small terrace between house and the sea. I set for a volume of Livy. I read and even took notes from where I had left off, as if it were a moment of free time. I hardly know whether to call it bravery or foolhardiness. I was 17 at the time. Up comes a friend of my uncle's, recently arrived from Spain. When he sees my mother and me sitting there, and me even reading a book, he scolds her for her calm and me for my lack of concern. But I kept on with my book. Now the day begins. With a still hesitant and almost lazy dawn, all around us buildings are shaken. We are in the open, but it is only a small area and we are afraid, nay certain that there will be a collapse. We decided to leave the town. Finally, a dazed crowd follows us, preferring our plan to their own. This is what passes for wisdom in a panic. Their numbers are so large that they slow our departure and then sweep us along. We stopped once we had left the buildings behind us. Many strange things happened to us there, and we had much to fear. The carts that we had brought were moving in opposite directions, though the ground was perfectly flat, and they wouldn't stay in place even with their wheels blocked by stones. In addition, it seemed as though the sea was being sucked backwards, as if it were being pushed back by the shaking of the land. Certainly the shoreline moved outwards, and many sea creatures were left on dry sand. Behind us were frightening dark clouds, rent by lightning, twisted and hurled, opening to reveal huge figures of flames. These were like lightning but bigger. At that point, the Spanish friend urged us strongly, "If your brother and uncle is alive, he wants you to be safe. If he had perished, he wanted you to survive him. So why are you reluctant to escape?" We responded that we would not look to our own safety as long as we were uncertain about his. Waiting no longer, he took himself off from the danger at a mad pace. It wasn't long thereafter that the cloud stretched down to the ground and covered the sea. It girdled Capri and made it vanish. It hid Misenum's promontory. Then my mother began to beg and urge and order me to flee, however I might, saying that a young man could make it and that she, weighed down in years and body, would die happy if she escaped being the cause of my death. I replied that I wouldn't save myself without her, and then I took her hand and made her walk a little faster. She obeyed with difficulty and blamed herself for delaying me. Now came the dust through, though still thinly. I look back. A dense cloud looms behind us, following us like a flood poured across the land. Let us turn aside while we can still see, lest we be knocked over in the street and crushed by the crowd of our companions. We had scarcely sat down when a darkness came that was like a moonless or cloudy night, but more like the black of closed, unlighted rooms. You could hear women lamenting, children crying, men shouting. Some were calling for parents, others for children or spouses. They could only recognize them by their voices. Some bemoaned their own lot, others that of a near and dear. There were some so afraid of death that they prayed for death. Many raised their hands to the gods, and even more believed that there were no gods any longer, and that this was one last unending night for the world. Nor were we without people who magnified real dangers with fictitious humors. Some announced that one or other part of the Misenum had collapsed or burned. Lies, but they found believers. It grew later, though that seemed not a return of day, but a sign that the fire was approaching. The fire itself actually stopped some distance away, but darkness and ashes came again, a great weight of them. We stood up and shook the ash off again and again. Otherwise, we would have been covered with it and crushed by the weight. I may boast that no groan escaped me in such perils, no cowardly word, but that I believed that I was perishing with the world, and that the world with me, which was a great consolation for death. At the last, the cloud thinned out and dwindled to no more than a smoke or fog. Soon there was real daylight. The sun was even shining through the lurid glow it has after an eclipse. The sight that met our still terrified eyes was a changed world, buried ash like snow. We returned to Miznium and took care of our bodily needs, but spent the night dangling between hope and fear. Fear was the stronger, for the earth was still quaking, and a number of people who had gone mad were mocking the evils that had happened to them, and others were terrifying prognostications. We still refused to go until we heard news of my uncle, although we had felt danger and expected more. You will read what I have written, but will not take up your pen, as the material is not the stuff of history. You have only yourself to blame if it seems not even proper stuff for a letter. Farewell. And so that is an account, a written letter that was an account of what happened during the eruption of Vesuvius. And so if you take a look, there's some questions there in the OMS again. Lister explains some of the similarities or differences between the two sources. What could Pliny tell us that the secondary source could not? And what could the secondary source tell us that Pliny could not? So if you visit that website there, History Online, Ancient Rome, Vesuvius, Italy, that will give you your secondary source. So that's basically information not from someone who was actually there. And so take some time after this flip video to click on your OMS to look through that, and then you can kind of answer those questions in your mind yourself, and you can look back to these pages. And then in your student guide, page 327, here's some side-by-side Pliny's account and then modern archaeological information that you can go ahead and look to side-by-side, okay? And you can maybe compare and contrast how an actual account may differ from archaeological information that has been gained. And again, you can pause this video at any point in time. And then thinking cap questions, which are on page 328. How does Pliny's account fit with current archaeological evidence? It is obvious that citizens of Pompeii were almost instantly overwhelmed by volcanic ash and fire from Vesuvius, since people and animal were found preserved in sleeping positions. Pliny gives a similar account. And then excavations corroborate Pliny's account of daily life. And how do new discoveries change our knowledge of history? We've learned a lot from archaeological evidence about the way people lived and died and what they considered important. And then important vocabulary. Pompeii is an ancient city in Italy, southeast of Naples. It was buried by an eruption of Vesuvius. Excavation of the site, which is extremely well preserved because of the volcanic ash, began in 1748. And then Vesuvius is an active volcano in southwest Italy near Naples. Again, its eruption destroyed the ancient city of Pompeii. Volcanic ash is that particle that they were talking about that was falling, that dust that filled the air. It's a mixture of rock, mineral, and glass particles expelled from a volcano during a volcanic eruption. So that's kind of floating all around as those people were, as you can imagine, kind of running around trying to seek cover. And then an archaeological dig, archaeological excavation, which is the same thing as a dig basically, is the procedure by which archaeologists define, retrieve, and record cultural and biological remains found in the ground. There are no reading pages for today, but I know this is a really long flip video because I did include those reading pages from the OMS. Our quote section, to be trustworthy in word, is close to being moral in that it enables one's words to be repeated. And that was said by Confucius and taken from the Analects. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know this was a really long flip video. I won't go through our list of more. I think you kind of have that down by now. I hope you have an amazing day. Thank you for joining me.